Okay, so I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. Some of you might have seen the webinar I gave a few weeks ago where I already emphasized how important it is that we collect this data in real time, because most of the official data is published with a lag and is also missing questions that are specific to this situation. So today I'll pick up on where I left off last time and show you some more evidence we have on the inequality of the impact. So this is again joint work with Abby Adams-Prassel, Teodora Buneva, and Marta Gulin. So first, we'll look a bit at how individual labor income has evolved over the course of the pandemic. So here we see the income distribution in the US in January. These are net monthly earnings, and it's a typical log normal distribution. And then if I show you the income distribution in April, you see that this is clearly shifted to the left, and this sums up to about a 17% drop in mean net labor income. So you can also see there's a big increase in zeros there. Looking in the UK, so now here I relate people's income from one month to the next. So on the x-axis, you have people's mean earnings in January, again, net labor income. And on the y-axis, you have the average net labor income in February. And what you see is that this line is basically the 45-degree line, okay? That means that if you, for instance, earn 2,000 pounds in January, then on average, you're going to be earning 2,000 pounds in February. So in normal times, this is a straight line. But we can see in March, this line already starts dropping below the 45-degree line. So incomes already were decreasing in March, and even more so in April. So in April, you can really see how this line drops below the 45-degree line across the entire distribution. So on average, no matter how much you earned, on average, you could expect to be earning less in April. But this average masks a lot of heterogeneity in terms of the dynamics. So here now, we see income changes from January to February in the US in a heat map. So on the y-axis, we have the earnings decile in January, where 0 means you had 0 income. And then the 10th decile means you were in the richest 10% of the income distribution. On the x-axis, we have people's earnings decile in February. And the darkness of a cell tells us how likely a transition is. So if we, for instance, look at this cell, this is the darkest cell. So about 90% of the people that were in the 10th decile in January were in the 10th decile in February. So basically, the rich stay rich. And in general, people tend to stay in the same decile. So we see that the diagonal, which is people staying in their same decile of the income distribution, is very dark. So there's not so much movement in normal times, so January to February. This upper triangle indicates people that are upward mobile. So they move up the relative ladder of income. And we see not so much going on there from one month to the next, and the same thing for the downward mobile. So in normal times, things are quite stable. And also, we have very few people who are dropping down to 0 income from higher incomes in normal times. Okay, so this is what it looks like in normal times, and now I'm going to show you what it looks like from March until April. So if I flip back and forth here, so this is March until April, what you see is that the diagonal now is less dark. Okay, there's more movement going on. And in particular, there's more movement in terms of downward mobility. So a better way maybe of showing this is in this heat map, where now red means that the relative transitions from March to April relative to January and February. Okay, so if a transition was rare in January, February, and now has become very frequent, it's red. If it was frequent January, February, and now has become rare, it's blue. So what do we see here? We see that there's less upward mobility, in particular for those at the bottom of the income distribution. So before, if you had 0 income or low income, you had a chance of moving up. And this has become less frequent now. So there's less upward mobility March to April. Similarly, there's more downward mobility. So you can see that not only those with zero income have become more likely to stay at zero income, but also across the deciles, people now are likely to drop down to zero income. So basically, most of the movement is happening at the bottom. We see that people at the bottom have become less likely to move up the income ladder, and people have become more likely to fall down the income ladder and near the bottom. So one thing that we can trace this back to are unstable work arrangements. So here we look in the UK, these are the share of people that lost their jobs due to the coronavirus in April. So what you see is the light blue bar are those that had temporary contracts, and the dark blue bar, permanent contracts. So you can see that amongst temporary workers, more than 1/3 lost their job due to the coronavirus. And this number is much lower for permanent contracts. Here we see the light green bar, people that do not receive a fixed salary. So it might depend on commissions, on sales, or on the hours worked. Whereas the dark green bars are people that receive a steady fixed salary every month. And what you see is that those that already have more volatile incomes, they're also more likely to have lost their jobs. And finally, there's been an increase in 0-hour contracts, the gig economy. So people that are not guaranteed to work, for instance, 40 hours a week. And you can see that people on these variable hour contracts, they're also more likely to have lost their jobs compared to people on fixed hour contracts. So in all three dimensions that you can look at, people on more unstable work relationships also were more likely to lose their jobs in this recession. Now, if we look at the US, we see the same patterns and also quite a similar magnitude. So again, people on less stable work relationships were more likely to lose their jobs. And now, if I show you the same figure for Germany, you're going to see that the patterns are very similar, but the magnitude is much smaller. So in Germany, we see much less job losses, but those job losses that took place were more likely to take place in unstable work relationships. One reason we think this might be the case is because in Germany, there was a short-time work scheme in place, which helped buffer the shock and help firms adapt to the lower demand. Now, another policy of firms that can buffer shocks for workers is paid sick leave, and this in particular during a pandemic. So here you see the variation in the share of people in the UK that have paid sick leave by occupation. Now, there is a guaranteed paid sick leave by the government, the statutory minimum, which is slightly less than £100 per week. So try living off of that. Most firms top this up. But here you see that there are many occupations where this is not the case. So now if people during the pandemic were not feeling well, working less, they saw big drops in their income. Now, other thing that is important to highlight here is that the red bars are people who are working in close proximity to customers and clients. And if you look at occupations such as personal care and service or food preparation and serving, so people that work close to customers, they're relatively unlikely to have access to paid sick leave topped up by their firm. Now, this can have a huge externality. We asked people how likely they would go to work despite having a cold, and here we see the share of people saying that they definitely would. And not surprisingly, those without access to additional paid sick leave are much more likely to go to work when they have symptoms. So not only is it important for the individual to buffer the shock of a pandemic, but in this case, it also can have large impacts in terms of externalities. So what has the UK government done to buffer these shocks to workers and firms? The biggest policy introduced is the furloughing scheme. So here, basically the work relationship between an employer and an employee is frozen. The worker is forbidden to work and receives 80% of their wage. And this is capped at £2,500. What we see on the left-hand side are the share of workers within an occupation on the x-axis in April and on the y-axis in May who are furloughed. And the same thing on the right-hand side for industries. So the first thing we see here is that there's quite some variation in terms of the share of workers that were furloughed across occupations and industries. The other thing we see is that these shares are very stable across time. So basically, in both cases, occupations and industries, it's very close to the 45-degree line, meaning that whoever was furloughed in April was also probably furloughed in May. So firms probably immediately, when the scheme rolled out at the end of March, put people on furloughed and they stayed there. But this is not equally distributed across people. So again, more vulnerable people are more likely to be furloughed. For instance, immigrants are more likely to be furloughed than natives. People on temporary contracts are more likely to be furloughed than people on permanent contracts. And again, those on the varying hour contracts are more likely to be furloughed than those on fixed hour contracts. And also in terms of gender, there are again inequalities here. Women are 3 percentage points more likely to be on furlough. And actually, for every child you have, likelihood of you being furloughed increases by 3 percentage points. So this highlights, so we saw before in Anna's talk, how important the closed schools are for children, but this also highlights how important it can be for inequality for workers. But one might think of the furloughing scheme as an equalizer because it's capped at £2,500. However, firms have the choice to top it up. And here we see on the x-axis, workers' earnings in 2019, and then the share of workers that are furloughed that receive the top up. And you can see that those that have higher incomes are more likely to have their income topped up while they're furloughed. But there are greater issues with the scheme. We find that 70% of furloughed workers report working non-zero hours. And in particular, those that had their salary topped up, they work 5 hours more per week. And those that have a job in which more tasks can be done from home, also working more hours. So it really seems here that a lot of firms and workers are living off of government subsidies right now, despite working. But it's not that positive for everyone. So we also find that furloughed workers, and this might be one reason why they're working, they're very afraid to lose their job, more so than people that are in a normal work relationship still. And a lot of them are already searching for other jobs. But in conclusion, a short-time work scheme would have suited everybody much better. It would have been better for the firms and the workers because they would have been able to work and earn money normally. The taxpayer would have had to cover less of the wages, and the consumer would have also had more access to these partially produced goods and services by firms. And what we're going to be doing moving forward with our surveys, we're studying the changing landscape of work. So last webinar, I talked a lot about working from home. And we're also looking into the reallocation across sectors and industries that's going to be taking place now. That's more in the long run. In the medium term, we're going to keep a close eye on what's going to happen when these temporary schemes are withdrawn. So for instance, the UK furloughing scheme is set to expire in October, and many of these workers might not be returning to their jobs. Thank you very much.